Hello and welcome to this evening's program. I'm Jennifer Keller, the Programming and Events Coordinator at the Westport Library. The library this evening has partnered with the Westport League of Women Voters to bring this event to you. And if this night isn't enough, our two organizations will be hosting a local debate on Thursday, October 15th, and registration is available through either westportlibrary.org or lwvwestport.org. So hope to see you then. Now, for this evening, a lot is happening during this election cycle, and media is obviously more present than ever before. And tonight, Leslie Levin will tell us about the constitutionality protected free speech in media with a focus on this year's elections. Before I introduce our speaker, please note that you can ask questions through the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your screen. It's probably not even where it is, but we will get them answered after her presentation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Leslie Levin, a professor of media and the law at UConn Law School and an expert on the legal profession, ethical decision-making, and lawyer discipline. Professor Levin graduated from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism and Columbia Law School, and has represented media clients, engaged in commercial litigation, and served on ethics committees. Besides teaching at UConn, she has also taught at New York University School of Law, the University of Haifa, and the University of Queensland. She has served on professional ethics boards and currently serves on the board of Connecticut Legal Services. And now I will turn the screen over to Leslie.
So thank you, Jennifer, and I want to thank the Westport Public Library for the invitation to speak tonight and the Westport League of Women Voters for co-sponsoring the event. So tonight I want to talk about our commitment as a country to free speech and how that has played out during the 2020 election cycle. Our founding fathers knew that democracy was an experiment. They believed that the First Amendment would promote informed self-government by allowing people to freely share their ideas without being constrained by government actors. And I think it's fair to say, and I think you probably agree, that they would be quite surprised to see where we are today with this experiment as we approach the 2020 election. So I'm going to start by making a somewhat heretical suggestion to you, which is that our commitment to free speech may be threatening our ability to intelligently self-govern. And I'd like to just talk about how we got here and the reasons why. And I want to suggest to you that the factors that led to this precarious point in our history include not only our deep commitment to free speech, but our lack of strong campaign finance laws, the news media, social media, the candidates, and ourselves, meaning the public. But very briefly, I want to talk about, put our free speech rights in perspective, and talk very briefly about the legal background, because I am, after all, a law professor. So, as you all know, the First Amendment has absolute language. It says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. And in fact, there aren't too many legal limits on what can be said by the public. You can't incite other people to violence. You can't send obscene material through the mail. But there are not too many other restrictions on speech. For example, even hate speech can't be easily regulated because of the First Amendment. Likewise, false speech is generally protected unless it ranges into the area of libel. And even a libel law is very hard to prove. Even libels are very hard to prove. So it's, even libelous statements often go unchallenged. So it's often possible in this country to say completely false and even pretty disgusting things about another person or group with no legal consequences. And it's very hard to write laws that limit speech, especially in the political context, which the founding fathers were so concerned about protecting. So today I want to start by talking about our free speech rights that are robust, but I also want to explain why they've not necessarily led to an informed citizenry as we approach this 2020 election. And let me start by talking about ordinary citizen speech, the kind that is maybe that's pretty common in over our history. But we've seen it in the last few months, and this is in the form of public protests that we see in the streets, and those are absolutely protected by the First Amendment. So, going back to May, there have been public protests in this that were initially sparked by the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May. And whether you think of those as protests or you think of them as riots is largely governed by the type of news outlet that you look at. Likewise, whether you think of them as spontaneous reactions to racial injustice or you think of them as an Antifa organized effort also depends on the media you consult. We've also seen protests at state capitals in Wisconsin, Michigan, and other states by people who are protesting the state stay-at-home orders and mask requirements. Many of those protesters are standing close together without masks, holding guns, in some states, and they're making their own political statements, and those are equally protected by the First Amendment. Again, depending on your ideological view, you'll have different beliefs about whether those were spontaneous protests or astroturf organizing by certain pro-gun and conservative groups. I don't think the Founding Fathers would be terribly surprised by any of that. Any of the protests that they saw, or even that we perceive those events differently depending upon our different ideological perspectives. But what I think would have surprised them is the significant role that campaign contributions, not just by individuals, but by organizations, play in shaping our different views about those protests. And so I want to talk briefly about elections and money. Because when you talk about political elections and free speech, it's impossible not to talk about campaign money. The Supreme Court has decided that monetary contributions to political candidates and causes are speech, and concluded in 2010 in a case called Citizens United that corporations and unions also have free speech rights. Consequently, the Supreme Court has struck down monetary limits on how much can be contributed by people and organizations to super PACs that support one candidate or another. And as you may know, super PACs can spend money to support political candidates. They just can't coordinate with the candidate's campaign. So the money that goes to super PACs then funds other speech, most notably advertisements supporting a candidate, also phone banks, canvassers, and signs. And as of late September, super PACs in this country reported receipt of over $1.4 billion and total expenditures of over $1 billion in this election cycle. The top 15 individual contributors gave about a quarter of that amount, $361 million. So wealthy individuals have an outsized voice in elections. That money has bought a lot of speech, primarily through political advertising in support of candidates. Super PAC advertising is being used to shape the narrative and our perception of the facts on the ground about a host of issues. For example, there have been dueling ads from super PACs on whether what we're seeing is moves toward racial justice or whether these are law and order problems, whether we're seeing protesters or rioters. Those are all narratives in super PAC funded ads. Other ads by super PACs range from trying to shape views about candidates' accomplishments, their health and mental capacity, the state of the economy, immigration, COVID-19, and the list goes on and on. Just quite a lot of money and speech is directed in that direction. Of course, what we know about what goes on in the world does not come only from political ads and doesn't even mostly come from political ads. It comes from the news media. There are several important features of our news media today that the Founding Fathers did not and could not possibly have anticipated. I want to mention just two. First is the speed and constancy with which news is reported. We have this 24-hour news cycle, and the impact of this on our attention span and ability to absorb information is profound. It's hard to critically process all the information that we receive. In fact, it's hard to even read through an entire article before jumping on to something else. And we often miss the nuance with so much information. Second is the extent to which media ownership has become consolidated and how those who control the media can shape our views of events. About 15 billionaires and 6 corporations own most of the US media sites. It's no secret that where we get our news affects greatly what we think about events. And it's fairly astonishing the differences in those views depending on which media outlets we consult. And I'm talking mainstream media outlets. I'm not talking about real outliers. So the liberal media report that there was Russian interference with the 2016 election that was at least tacitly encouraged by people associated with the Donald Trump campaign. Conservative media question whether there was any Russian interference and suggest that there was a Clinton-inspired effort to falsely implicate President Trump in the alleged interference. Two very different views of reality. Now, today there are very few nonpartisan media outlets in the United States. This has been true for a few decades. Going back to 1996, Fox News was created by Rupert Murdoch to appeal to conservative audiences. He was filling a perceived need, the perception being that the media at that time was more left-leaning, and that there was a demand for conservative voices. And Fox has always been unabashedly right-leaning. The level of partisanship, though, in terms of how the media behave, has increased over the years. And it has gotten even worse since 2016 for at least two reasons. The first is that reporters became concerned about reporting what candidate and then President Trump said when they believed his statements were false. They were concerned that they were being used to amplify false messages. Rightly or wrongly, this is what some of the more liberal media reporters thought. So many made conscious decisions to start identifying what they viewed as false statements at the same time as they were reporting the statements. So what used to be neutral leads on the front pages of papers frequently now call out the president for what reporters view as distortions and falsehoods. This has increased the perception and the reality of partisanship on the part of some of the media. And while the traditional media deserve its share of blame for the public distrust by being partisan and by sometimes making mistakes in its rush to get news out in the 24-hour news cycle, candidate and then President Trump also has directly contributed to the distrust of the media. President Trump has repeatedly criticized news organizations and reporters, has attempted to pull their credentials, mocked them, and labeled unfavorable news as fake news. This has eroded trust in the media across the board, with the Gallup poll from last year showing that only 41% of those who responded said that they trusted the media. It has made those who support President Trump trust the media even less. And in fact, almost 70% of Republicans say that they do not trust the media. The president's criticism has in turn made media even more critical of the president in their reporting. And here I just want to give you an example of a gratuitously critical lead in the New York Times this morning. Quote, "The White House that President Trump woke up to this morning was in full-blown chaos, even by the standards of the havoc of the Trump era." Now, this was front page of the New York Times above the fold. You would not have seen a lead like that on the front page of the New York Times 5 years ago. I don't think you would have seen it inside the paper either, except for perhaps on the opinion page. Basically, the media and the president, the liberal media and the president are in a state of open warfare at the moment. President Trump's attacks on the media have also made the media more distrustful of what he and his administration say. So recent examples of the distrust is reporting around President Trump's condition while he was in the hospital. There's great distrust, at least on the part of the left-leaning media, and the information that they were receiving from doctors at the time. And they were coming up with some things that actually, frankly, look like conspiracy theories, and to some extent, perhaps some information wasn't being revealed, but they were in a frenzy about it. So at this point, consumers know whether major news sources lean left or lean right. They tend to take at face value information that comes from media sources that reflect their ideological views and reject the views or never even consult the news sources with which they disagree. And this leads us to the impact of the internet. So the internet held great promise when it first appeared to give everyone a greater voice in our democracy. And it clearly has some features that promote democracy and the exchange of ideas in what was vaunted as the marketplace of ideas. So we don't need to own a newspaper, and we don't have to have a broadcasting license to disseminate our views as citizens. The internet allows any individual's ideas to be amplified through retweeting or through sharing of messages far beyond the usual circle where our views would be heard. Social media now enables politicians to talk directly to the electorate, for example, via Twitter. And in some ways, our founding fathers would probably applaud that. Because there's no intermediary and you can get your word out directly. But the internet has also created an informational echo chamber. And this has happened in two ways. And let's start with the way in which most people find information on the internet, which is Google. So Google has 90% of the search engine market worldwide. So I suspect virtually everybody who is listening to me uses Google at least occasionally. So if you put a search term into Google, it will show you first the sources that it thinks you want to see based on what you have looked at in the past. And if you put in a search term into Google, and I put a search term into Google, let's say the word COVID-19 or the words Joe Biden, we will see different pages come up, and those pages are determined by algorithms that consider our previous searches. So we will inadvertently see at first information that confirms our views because we're looking at sources we have looked at before. Most people don't realize this happens. And they don't keep reading through all the pages until they finally get to something that might contradict their views. We also subconsciously create echo chambers through our social media use. And I know not everybody uses social media that I'm talking to, but a lot of people do. So we friend and follow our friends and family and people we agree with. And most of us who use social media don't friend or follow people with whom we deeply disagree. So we keep seeing the same types of views and the same sources reinforced in our social media feeds. Now, this is significant because so many Americans get their news from social media. In fact, more Americans get their news on social media than they do from newspapers. Admittedly, this tends to be younger people. But this is just the case. I teach media and the law, and my students every one of them, get their news primarily from social media. More than 4 in 10 Americans now get their news on Facebook. So what viewers can see there is critically important to their understanding of the world. So here's the thing about Facebook and social media platforms. They have tremendous power to determine the content that appears on their sites. And to put these companies in perspective, there are 235 million Americans on Facebook. 73% of US adults use YouTube. Almost 25% of American adults use Twitter. Because of the First Amendment, the government cannot easily make laws abridging freedom of speech. So Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all the social media platforms can pretty much decide what content they will allow to appear on their platforms and what content they will not allow to appear on their platforms. They are also free of potential liability for what gets posted on their platforms by a law called the Communications Decency Act. So if someone posts something libelous or hateful on Facebook, the Facebook has no legal responsibility for it. Does not require to take it down, and it cannot be sued for libel. These social media companies actually don't want to police speech on their sites. They favor free speech. They think it's a good thing. But they have come under increasing pressure, mostly from the public, to start policing. So companies like Facebook and Twitter have developed community standards, but sometimes those standards are loosely and inconsistently enforced by the companies. Now, in their defense, trying to police everything that goes on these social media sites is an extremely difficult task. On Facebook, every 60 seconds, 147,000 photos are uploaded and 54,000 links are shared. That's every minute. So it's an enormous amount of information. But even when they learn of violations of their community standards, Facebook doesn't consistently remove offensive content. For example, after President Trump announced that he had COVID-19, Twitter reminded people that a wish or a hope for serious bodily harm or fatal disease against anyone will be removed. So in other words, people couldn't say that they hoped that President Trump died. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez noted the hypocrisy of that because Facebook and Twitter had not taken down comments in which she had been threatened with rape or murder by people on Facebook and Twitter. Under normal circumstances, Facebook and other social media platforms will engage in content moderation, the depublication or downranking of information, or the complete removal of account users. So Facebook will take down speech that violates its community standards ordinarily if it becomes aware of it. So this would include things that are considered hate speech, harassment, bullying, false news. Facebook and Twitter use algorithms, they use fact checkers, they use complaints from the public and other approaches to determine what they will remove. Facebook, in fact, took down 3.2 billion fake accounts in 2019, as well as some legitimate accounts. And just to give you an example, Facebook and Twitter both removed accounts of the conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, who, among other things, attempted to claim that the Sandy Hook shootings did not happen. But during the 2020 election cycle, I should say that during this cycle, Twitter has added warning labels to some of the president's tweets in responding to what they thought were perhaps misleading statements. In contrast, Facebook has taken a largely hands-off policy, and it has to deceptive statements that are made by political figures on the theory that the public should be able to know what politicians say. In recent months, though, even Facebook has become somewhat more proactive on monitoring false speech during elections. For example, with respect to handling of COVID-19, false claims about COVID-19. Facebook removed a video from President Trump's Facebook page where he had posted a Fox interview in which he said falsely that children were almost immune from COVID. Facebook has also removed 7 million other posts for sharing false news about COVID. But Facebook has been less aggressive in removing false information about the election. For example, when President Trump tweeted misleading posts casting doubt on mail-in ballots or encouraging people to vote twice, Facebook has only responded by posting a link with accurate information about voting. Twitter has gone further. It has posted as potentially misleading comments or statements that say that things are potentially misleading, including even on presidential tweets. The removal and labeling practices have generated claims that Facebook and Twitter's activities have been more directed to conservative speech than liberal speech. At least one academic article has suggested that's not true, but it will remain to be tested and seen whether that is true. The platforms have wrestled, though, with how to handle these issues and political ads that contain false claims. This is a very important issue because it's estimated that $1 billion will be spent on digital advertising during this election cycle. Some platforms like Twitter, TikTok, LinkedIn are not accepting political ads. Facebook is running ads and initially said it would not correct false ads that came from campaigns, but would correct false ads that came from super PACs. In fact, Facebook has been slow to remove ads that have come from false ads from super PACs. And those ads sometimes get views by hundreds of thousands of eyeballs before they are removed. Facebook has said it will not run any new political ads the final week before the election, and has announced in late September that it will not run ads that seek to delegitimize the outcome of the election. That was just last week. And just today it announced it would not run political ads or issue-based ads after the polls close on November 3rd. It is frankly concerned about social stability after the election. But they are literally making the rules up as they go along. And what's striking about this is that these are private, unelected companies with profit motives that are making the rules about what the public can and cannot see during the 2020 election. Now, I said at the outset that the public is partly responsible for where we are now, and let me explain why. Americans are not sophisticated consumers of media content, although in our defense, we are inundated with it. Studies have shown that even though people often think that they can spot fake news, and by that I mean deliberately false stories, they cannot. People need training to learn how to evaluate what they read and to test the reliability of the material. We're starting to teach school children how to do this, but adults need to learn how to do it also. Without much training, there are cognitive biases that cause people to tend to listen to and take at face value ideas with which they agree. And it is now very easy to find that content. Too often, we don't seek out information that conflicts with our views. It is easy to stay in our informational bubble. And it's painful, frankly, to see ideas that conflict with our own beliefs and worldview. And so we often look away, even when we're confronted with it. So if this hasn't depressed you enough, let me tell you what really worries me. One is an issue I haven't touched on, which is the loss of so much local news. Over the last 15 years, 1 in 5 newspapers, more than 1,800 newspapers, have closed, largely due to the internet and the loss of classified advertising to places like Craigslist. 60 newspapers have closed since COVID-19 appeared in the United States. Many communities have no local newspaper. So the people who live in those communities are not well informed about things, about local issues such as mayoral or city council races, school board decisions, and things of that sort. This is obviously not a good development when it comes to an informed electorate. Another thing that concerns me is truly fake news. And I'm not just talking about information with which we disagree. I'm talking about really fake news. It's not hard for someone to deliberately create fake news and disseminate it via social media with serious consequences. We can see this now, and we saw a stark example of it in 2016 in an incident that became known as Pizzagate. That was a false story that originated from a white supremacist about a pedophilia ring linked to Hillary Clinton. It first appeared on Twitter. It was picked up by some conspiracy websites. It was promoted on other social media. And it included the claim that there were children locked up in Washington, D.C. at a pizza joint, and that they were being held hostage by a pedophilia ring. Edgar Madison Welch, who read about this on the internet, drove from North Carolina to this pizza parlor in D.C. with an assault-style gun. He walked past pizza customers, including children, and shot the lock off of a door where he thought the child victims were hiding. Welch believed what he was inclined to believe. He thought that Hillary Clinton already thought she was a bad actor, and when he saw that she was involved with a pedophilia ring, he was willing to believe that too. And this fake news prompted violent action. This fake news has persisted and become a central part of the beliefs of QAnon followers. We continue to see fake news in the media, in the social media during this election that comes from domestic sources. There's also evidence that we are seeing disinformation circulated by foreign influences connected to Russia again in this election cycle, and to a lesser extent by China and Iraq. Facebook and Twitter recently removed hundreds of fake accounts linked to Russian military intelligence and Kremlin-backed actors. These sites set up fictitious persona, some of which appeared to be news outlets. It was the FBI that tipped off the media platforms. They did not find this on their own. Some of these fake accounts seek to divide the left from more centrist parts of the Democratic Party. Others seek to divide people on issues of race, immigration, and guns. We have enough problems sorting through information that comes to us domestically that we don't also need foreign interference. There's also been domestic micro-targeting of voters to suppress turnout. Micro-targeting is the use of digital information that's collected by Google and social media platforms who know a lot about people's voting preferences and other preferences. And so ads are then sent to those people who they believe are likely to vote one way or another. It's very fine-grained information. Micro-targeting of Black voters in Florida in the last election occurred for the purpose of depressing the Black vote for Hillary Clinton. The advertising said that she thinks Blacks are predators. This kind of it's one thing to advertise for a candidate or even negatively against a candidate. This micro-targeting is really trying to suppress votes. So I worry that our commitment to free speech, even to false speech, is contributing to a loss of faith in the media and in public institutions. It is being used to undermine faith in the legitimacy of our upcoming election, even before the election has occurred. Social media has proved to be a breeding ground for conspiracy theories and extremism, and it is very difficult to root this out. Sometimes people who are just curious get sucked into these groups. And I'm concerned that some people are moving from platforms that at least do some content moderation, like Facebook or Twitter, to others that do not do content moderation at all. In some of those places, and also on Facebook, you can find people already organizing for armed conflict if the election does not come out as they hope. So as I mentioned, these social media companies, which are private and unelected organizations largely composed of 20 and 30-something-year-old people, are deciding how to deal with these issues or are deciding not to deal with them at all. So let me end my remarks with some positive news as we think about free speech and the 2020 election cycle. We have seen, so on the positive side, we've seen social movements mobilize in 2020 through a combination of the right to free speech, the right to assemble, and also the ability to organize through the internet. These same factors have also facilitated positive activities like voter registration efforts. Politicians have been able to speak directly to the public, and it's free when they do so. And they have an unfiltered way then to get out their message. So Andrew Yang, for example, was greatly helped by social media. He would not have been on the debate stage during the primaries without it. Candidates can take their messages directly to voters rather than have the media act as an intermediary or an interpreter of what they are saying. And if the candidates think that the media got something wrong, they can try to correct the record. Ordinary people can share their views and can easily access a lot of different information if they choose to do so. So tonight, for example, also on the positive side, we have a debate between a man and a woman who are candidates for the Vice President of the United States, and millions of people will be watching to become better informed about the candidates. This is something that would not have happened and could not have been viewed by so many when our First Amendment was ratified. And the most recent presidential debate, while not a lesson in decorum, attracted 73 million viewers, which means that people are engaged with the democratic process. And notwithstanding my concerns that I've laid out, I'm actually a big fan of the First Amendment and free speech. I think it's fundamentally important to our democracy. But what I think we are seeing is the natural and unexpected consequences of what happens when it is abused. So I think our greatest hope may lie with the electorate, which needs to be better educated and to understand the process by which they receive information and how to critically evaluate the news so that they can make informed decisions as voters. These are really hard issues, and I definitely don't have a lot of answers, but I'm going to stop here for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie. We have some questions from the audience, and if you still have questions, you can type them in at any time, so I'm happy to read your questions. The first one is from Paul. He says, as a news organization and beyond a news judgment, does freedom of speech demand that you publish?
As a news organization, no. In fact, nothing demands that you publish. It's the First Amendment. You cannot be compelled to speak. No, absolutely no.
Okay. And do you believe that social media should have the same regulations as print and TV?
It's so complicated. It's a great question. So print and TV actually have different regulations. There may be ways to regulate social media differently, but and do I think they should be? Yes, I think so. So to answer specifically the question, yes, I do think they should be regulated differently if it were possible to regulate them. The problem is because of the First Amendment, it's very difficult for Congress or state legislatures to write laws that will survive what's called strict scrutiny, which is a very high standard to meet for the legislation. Social media has particular challenges because it is allowing people to talk to one another. So I do think if we could regulate it, that it should be regulated differently. It has some known dangers that I think could constitute what we would call a compelling state interest to be able to regulate it. And if it were possible, it would be helpful if we could do it. Although the person who figures out there's two things that people are going to make a lot of money at. The people who figure out, first of all, how to do good content moderation are going to make a lot of money. And I think the people who figure out how the law should work in a way that are going to stand up to constitutional scrutiny, I don't know if they'll get a lot of money, but they will be heroes. But so yes, I do think that there should be different rules. I will say, just to complete that though, in terms of the difference between say TV and newsprint, because a lot of the TV is broadcast, they have licenses, and they actually have some equal opportunity requirements that don't apply to newspapers. I don't think we need that for the internet, but that is just one distinction I wanted to mention between the two.
Okay, and this next question has to do with websites. Shouldn't I be allowed to publish obscene content to my website?
Yes. Yes, you can do that, but you can't send it through the mail. I think that's the answer.
Okay. So here's another one. Do you think that there's a way for the media to regain the public's trust? And could our media ever, do you think, go back to being a little less partisan than it is right now?
I'm basically an optimist, so I think yes. I think this is a really unusual moment in our history. And I like to think that journalists know that they have departed from ordinary norms. Like I said, what we're seeing now on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post, or on the banner headlines for NBC or anything else, they're not like anything we've seen before. I don't think I overstated it when I said there's a war going on right now between the president and the press. And I think I'm hoping that there will be some reversion to norms. The other thing that we see is that the press goes up and down in terms of its relationship to the public. So, for example, right after Watergate, the views of the press were very high because people felt like the media had revealed information that was really important to know. And then there's other times, like now, when it's not so high. But I have to say that as low as it is now, it was even lower 2 years ago. So, I'm hopeful that things will recover somewhat.
Okay. This next question is just, are we beyond truth?
Are we post-truth?
I think that's what he's asking.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that we are, but that would be a very depressing thought. I think it's human nature to strive for the truth. And I'm hoping that some way we figure out a way to protect free speech and even some false speech, because the idea is you need some breathing room so that you're not inhibited from your speech. But that perhaps there's some way we can move away from this idea that completely false and deliberately false speech is legally acceptable. That may not be true, but I think that we just have this human need for the truth. We strive for it. So I don't think I don't think we're post-truth.
Okay, well, that makes me feel better. And then I think I have one more question. Do you think that, or could the First Amendment ever be tweaked to constrain the false speech moving forward, do you think? Or would we just legislate some other way?
Well, we can't legislate around it. We'd have to change the amendment. And that happens, but it's a very, a lot of states have to agree to it. and it's a difficult process. And the real challenge is, what would it be? What would we say instead? And how close do we want to get to that line where the government can dictate, or law can dictate, what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable? So it could happen through amendment, or frankly, I guess. So just to talk a little bit more about the strict scrutiny, what you've got to do with strict scrutiny is you've got to show you have a really compelling state interest. And I think that perhaps what we're seeing now in terms of the dangers of deliberately false speech may be such a compelling state interest that the court would be convinced that it's compelling state interest. And then you have to be really smart about how you draft legislation. We don't have a lot of high-functioning legislators at the moment, but maybe someday we can hope that there's some way to at least deal with some of the most troubling speech, particularly on the internet.
Okay. We actually have one more question. Where do you stand on the practice of objectivity, which could be just he said, she said? I think the question is asking about when there's maybe a story that we can't fact check as much.
Well, I don't know. So, or I'm not sure. Or the question could be, is it just the reporter's job to report what happened, or is it also their job to comment on whether or not they think it's true? And that's very difficult to say. I mean, so around the time of the election, I'm on Twitter, really because my students are on Twitter, but I follow a lot of journalists, and I saw them really wrestling with, what do we do about becoming mouthpieces, basically, for President Trump, when we don't think if we just report what he says and we don't say, but actually, this doesn't seem to be true. I do think that there's value in, and I'm not putting aside President Trump, in if somebody says X and X is false, identifying that. I actually do think that's part of a reporter's job. So if by objective you mean just reporting the facts, I guess if the facts include that what you just heard wasn't true, that should be reported as well.
Okay. And actually, we just got another question that just flew in. So in regards to free speech, should we have greater protection against libel and slander if a lie is proved when the liar is guilty?
So that's a really great question. So there's a lot of protection now against libel. And it was originally because it was public officials that were suing for libel, and the Supreme Court wanted to protect people who were criticizing the government from libel claims, and so they created a very high standard that public figures and public officials have to meet in order to prevail. The standard is lower for ordinary people who get, not public figures, but just ordinary people, and I think the standard's about right for them. The thing about libel is there's lots of reasons why people wouldn't bring a libel case, even if they are libeled, and particularly politicians. So people may say something false about President Trump, and false and defamatory, and he might not want to bring a lawsuit just because he would have to reveal some things he didn't want to reveal, and so that would be a reason as well. Or it costs money, or it's just not worth it because people don't believe the speaker, or the person is what we call libel proof, and their reputation is so low they're not going to recover very much money anyway. So it's not just a problem with the law, and it's not even primarily a problem with the law. It's other things around it, I think, that allow people just to say all kinds of stuff that doesn't, that would be libelous if somebody wanted to pursue the action. The other thing I guess I want to mention is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and this is something that that President Trump has complained about. And it came from, so this is the law that says that what gets posted on social media is not the responsibility of the social media platform, but is only the person who posts it can be held liable, say for defamation. And it came initially from this impulse that the internet was new and Congress wanted to encourage speech, and they were afraid that social media companies would feel like they always had to monitor what went up on their social media platforms if they were going to be held liable for what went up there. So that's why they said that social media platforms would not be responsible for any of it, and they don't have an obligation to monitor. But we've now, 20 years later or more, I think it was from 1996, more than that, we're now seeing some of the consequences of that. And so President Trump may be right that it may be appropriate to reconsider whether we're going to have social media companies, social media platforms be completely free of any liability for anything that gets posted on the website, even if on their platforms, even when they know about it. Maybe we should be rethinking that.
Great. Well, I want to thank you again, Leslie, for a truly educational evening with us. I want to let everybody watching know that the Westport Library actually has a resource guide on the First Amendment and free speech. So if you go to westportlibrary.org to our resource guides, we have already done some of the research for you. So, and it makes life a little bit easier. This program will be available to watch again in just a few moments, right here on this same link that you used to come in today. You can share that with friends who might want to understand the First Amendment and free speech a little bit better. They can log in at any time after this event. For videos from previous programs and information about upcoming events, definitely remember to visit westportlibrary.org. We are adding events all the time, and we'd love to see you at an event sometime soon. So thanks again, Leslie, and thank you all for attending tonight.